The coffee grinder jammed at 6:47 a.m., and that was how Adeline Marsh knew the day was going to be hard before it even started. She stood behind the counter of her café, Groundwork, a narrow corner spot in Portland's Pearl District that smelled like dark roast and wood polish. Pressing her thumb against the reset button with the kind of practiced patience she'd learned from 3 years of running a business alone and 4 years of raising a daughter the same way. The grinder clicked, hummed, died again. Mom. Petra appeared in the kitchen doorway, 7 years old, still wearing her pajamas with the small owls printed on them, hair a nest of sleep. There's a man outside staring at the cafe, probably just waiting for us to open. We don't open for an hour. Adeline looked up. Through the front window, past the hand-lettered hours and the small chalkboard menu propped on the sidewalk, a man stood on the opposite curb, dark coat, hands in his pockets. Not moving, just watching the building the way people watch things they already owned. She didn't recognize him, but something in the stillness of him made her stomach pull the way it did before a storm, when the air pressure dropped and the world went quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like warning. "Go finish getting dressed," Adeline said, "and eat the oatmeal I left on the stove. It has raisins. It has raisins." Petra disappeared, grumbling. Adeline looked back at the window. The man was gone. She told herself it was nothing. She was good at telling herself that. She'd been doing it for 4 years, ever since the night Daniel Voss walked out of her apartment and out of their lives. No fight, no goodbye. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said I'm not built for this and a space where his presence used to be. She'd learned to call things nothing so Petra wouldn't see her scared. So the bills didn't feel like catastrophes. So Tuesday morning coffee grinders jamming at 6:47 weren't omens. Nothing, she told herself. By noon, she'd fixed the grinder, served 67 customers, and let herself forget the man on the curb entirely. He walked in at 12:23. She knew it was him before she turned around. The way the room changed, conversations quieting, her barista Tomas going still mid-wipe on the counter, told her something had shifted in the air before she even heard the door. He was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s maybe, with the kind of face that would have been easy to look at if it weren't so deliberately closed. Dark hair, sharp jaw, a scar along his left eyebrow that looked like old violence healed wrong. He wore his coat like armor. He moved through the space between tables with the careful, controlled stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning to be underestimated. He sat down at the counter. Adeline brought him a menu. He didn't open it. "You're Adeline Marsh," he said, formerly Adeline Voss. Her hand tightened on the laminated edge of the menu. "Marsh is my name," she said evenly. "Voss was a mistake," I corrected. Something moved behind his eyes, not amusement exactly, but more like recognition. "I need to speak with you. About Daniel. Daniel and I have been divorced for 4 years. I know." He said it like it didn't change anything. "My name is Reed Callahan, and I'm afraid the mistake you corrected didn't entirely correct itself." She didn't invite him to elaborate. She made him a coffee, black, because he hadn't ordered anything, and she needed something to do with her hands. And she set it in front of him and waited, because she'd also learned in 4 years that refusing to show fear was the first line of every defense she had. Reed Callahan, it turned out, was not a good man. He said this himself, with a directness that surprised her. He ran what he called a logistics operation out of Seattle, which was the kind of careful language that meant something uglier underneath. Supply chains, he explained, that moved things across borders, that those things weren't supposed to cross. He was careful with words. She translated them as she listened. Daniel had owed his operation a significant sum, had been, for 2 years before the divorce, funneling money through accounts Adeline had never known existed, accounts that included, in one very specific and very legal set of documents filed in Multnomah County, her name. She was on paper as a co-owner of 4 shell companies she had never heard of. "You're going to tell me I have to pay his debts," she said. "I'm going to tell you that in 6 weeks, a federal investigation is going to surface those documents, and your name is going to be on every one of them." He said it without inflection, the way someone delivered a diagnosis they'd already made peace with. "Unless the money is returned. I don't have his money, I know." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she'd given him, not drinking it, just holding the warmth. Daniel does, and Daniel has been unreachable for 11 days. The cafe hummed around them. The milk steamer hissed. Tomas was pretending to reorganize the pastry case and doing a bad job of hiding that he was listening. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know." A pause that felt strange from him, like he'd rehearsed the sentence and hadn't quite committed to the tone of it yet. "And because I need your help finding him." Adeline looked at the man sitting across her counter, this careful, closed, quietly dangerous man with old violence healed into his eyebrow, and thought about Petra upstairs in their apartment, doing her reading homework, wearing socks with foxes on them, completely unaware that her father's old life was apparently sitting at her mother's coffee bar on a Tuesday. "Get out of my cafe," she said. He left. He didn't argue. He set a business card on the counter and walked out into the Portland noon without looking back. She threw the card in the trash. She retrieved it at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. She found Daniel's name in 3 places over the next 5 days. Once, in a property record, Petra's pediatrician's billing department accidentally CC'd to the wrong email. Daniel Voss listed as owner of a residential property in Bend, Oregon, under an LLC Adeline had never heard of. Once in a text from her sister, who mentioned she'd seen a man who looked like Daniel at a casino in Reno 6 months ago, and hadn't mentioned it because she figured Adeline didn't want to know. And once in Petra's backpack, tucked inside a library book that Petra said a man at the school pickup had handed her and told her to give to her mom. The library book was a copy of Goodnight Moon. Inside the front cover, in Daniel's handwriting, "I'm sorry. Don't look for me, please." Adeline sat on the kitchen floor and held the book for a long time. Then she called Reed Callahan. He answered on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "Someone gave my daughter a message from Daniel," she said, at her school pickup. A silence that felt very different from the silences he'd used in the cafe. Tighter. She heard something shift. A chair, maybe. Movement. "Are you both home?" "Yes. Stay there." He arrived in 40 minutes, which meant he'd been in Portland already. He came inside without being invited. She'd left the door unlocked because she didn't know what else to do. And he did the thing she hadn't expected. He checked the apartment first. Systematically, quietly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a long time making sure spaces were safe before he allowed himself to occupy them. He looked in closets. He checked the windows. He looked at Petra's door without opening it. "She's asleep," Adeline said. "Good." He settled in her kitchen, across the table from her, and looked at the library book she'd set between them. He read Daniel's note. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat in a way that told her this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "He knows they're looking for him," Reed said. "Not just me. There are other people involved in this, Adeline. People I can't control and didn't invite." "What kind of people?" "The kind you contact the FBI about." He said it plainly. "Except contacting the FBI means those documents with your name on them become part of a federal case." She understood then, the shape of it. Not just the debt and the missing money and the shell companies. The whole architecture of the trap Daniel had built around her without her knowing, whether from carelessness or calculation, she still didn't know. The building she'd constructed her life inside for 4 years was sitting on a foundation that someone else had poured without her permission. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "I want to find Daniel before they do, and you know him better than anyone alive. I thought I knew him. You knew the version he let you see. But people leave traces, even in the versions they perform." He looked at her steadily. He had a way of doing that. She was noticing, looking without looking away, like he'd made a decision about what deserved his attention and wasn't easily moved from it. The way someone takes their coffee, the places they walk when they're scared, the habits they kept from before whoever they were pretending to be. Adeline thought about Daniel. The real Daniel, or the one she'd believed was real. He took his coffee with too much sugar and always apologized for it. He couldn't sleep unless the window was cracked, even in winter. When he was anxious, he drove. He'd drive for hours with no destination, just motion, because motion felt like control. He goes to water, she said finally, when he's scared. Oceans, rivers, lakes, it doesn't matter. He just needs to see something moving that's bigger than him. Raid looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said quietly. That's something. They found Daniel 11 days later. Not the way she'd expected to find him. Not in the way anyone would have wanted. He was in a rented room above a bait shop on the Oregon coast, in a town called Tillamook, sitting in a chair next to a window that looked out over Tillamook Bay. He'd lost weight. His hair had grown out. He looked like the version of himself that existed before the version she'd married, before whatever choices had built the Daniel Voss, who left a note on her counter and disappeared into a life she'd never been permitted to see. He wasn't dangerous. He'd never been dangerous. That was the thing about Daniel. The tragedy and the crime of him was that he was just a man who'd made wrong choices, because wrong choices were easier than honest ones, and he'd kept making them until they were impossible to unmake. He had a laptop. He had documentation. He'd been, in his own fractured, too-late way, building a case, records of transactions, communications, names. I knew they'd find you eventually, he said when Adeline walked in. He looked at her like seeing her hurt him, which she understood was probably true, which did not make her feel generous. I didn't know you'd be with him. Did you know they'd involve Petra? She asked, when they gave her that book. Did you know it would be a child? Daniel closed his eyes. That was answer enough. Reed stood in the doorway and let Adeline run the conversation. She understood later that this was a choice on his part, not passivity, but deliberate restraint. An understanding that this wasn't his story to close. What she said to Daniel, she didn't repeat to anyone. What he gave her, the laptop, the documents, the full record of what he'd built and then tried to escape, she took with both hands. Not for him. For Petra, who would one day want to know that her mother had done something instead of letting the architecture of someone else's bad choices determine the floor plan of their lives. On the drive back from Tillamook, Reed drove, and she sat in the passenger seat, holding the laptop on her knees and didn't talk for 40 miles. Then she said, "You didn't have to let me do that alone." "Yes, I did," he said. "It was yours to do." She looked at him in the dark of the car, at the profile of a face she was starting to be able to read. "How long have you been in this? What you do? 12 years. Do you want to leave it?" A pause. Not avoidance, consideration. "I've been asking myself that for about 2 of them. What made you start asking?" He didn't answer right away. They crossed the bridge over the Wilson River, and the headlights caught the water below, moving fast and silver black. "I did something I thought was justified," he finally said, "and I was right that it was justified and wrong that it felt clean. And once you feel the difference between those two things, it's hard to stop noticing it." Adeline looked back out at the highway. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The legal part was slow and unglamorous, and nothing like what movies suggested. The FBI got the documents. The FBI looked at the documents for 6 weeks and then asked Adeline to come in. She went with a lawyer she'd found through her sister, a woman named Greta Sund, who specialized in cases where ordinary people had been used as fronts by people they trusted. Greta Sund was 60 years old and had a handshake like a door closing, and made it very clear to the 2 federal agents in that conference room that Adeline Marsh had been a victim of financial fraud by a former spouse, and was now cooperating fully and voluntarily, and if they had thoughts otherwise, she was interested in hearing them articulated in writing. They didn't. The shell companies were dissolved. Adeline's name was cleared. Daniel took a plea. Reed's situation was more complicated, and Adeline understood it only in pieces, that the documentation had implicated people above him in ways that created leverage, and that leverage had been traded for something she didn't ask too many questions about because Greta Sund had advised her not to, and Greta Sund had not steered her wrong yet. Reed Callahan, as far as the public record was concerned, had cooperated with a federal investigation and was no longer operating any logistics business of any kind. What he was doing instead, Adeline didn't know. Not immediately. She focused on Petra. She focused on the café. She fixed the coffee grinder properly this time, replaced the part that had been halfway failing for 6 months, and stood back and listened to it run and felt something in her chest that was quiet and clean and not nothing. She told Petra, in age-appropriate pieces, that there had been some paperwork confusion involving her father that was now resolved. Petra absorbed this with the practicality of a child who had been raised by a mother who handled things and asked if they could get a fish, and Adeline said yes, and they spent a Saturday afternoon at the pet store choosing a betta fish that Petra named Captain. Captain died 2 weeks later, which Petra took hard and then recovered from in the remarkable way that 7-year-olds recovered from things, which reminded Adeline, not for the first time, that children were often less fragile than you treated them. It was 3 months after Tillamook when Reed appeared again. Not on the curb across the street, not in a way that made the room go quiet. He sent a text, which felt deliberately ordinary, like he was practicing something. "If you're open for a coffee, I'll come by. If not, I won't," she texted back. "We open at 7. He came in at 7:04, took the same counter stool, and this time picked up the menu. "You actually looked at it," she said. "I thought I should try." He looked up. He looked different. Not softer exactly, that wasn't the word for him, and probably never would be, but less armored, like he'd put down something heavy and was still getting used to the absence of the weight. "What do you recommend?" "Depends what you want. Something I don't usually let myself have." She considered him for a moment. Then she made him a lavender honey latte, which was the most popular thing they served and which she'd never have pegged him for. She put it down in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took a sip and said nothing for a long time. "Well?" she asked. "I've made a lot of bad choices," he said. "This isn't one of them." Adeline leaned on the counter. The café was filling up behind him, the familiar Tuesday morning rhythm of it, the steamer and the doorbell and Tomas moving through his opening routine with the competence she'd spent 2 years teaching him. Her life was in this room, the version she'd built on her own terms, from the rubble of a different version. "Reed," she said, and his name felt strange and specific in her mouth, the way the names of people who mattered started feeling when you stopped being careful about them. "Why are you here?" "Because I've spent 12 years making choices that were justified and didn't feel clean," he said, "and I'd like to try making some that feel clean even if they're not justified yet. That's not a reason to be in my coffee shop at 7 in the morning." "No," he agreed. "The reason for that is you." She looked at him. This man with old violence healed into his face, who had sat in her kitchen at 2 in the morning and checked her closets and then let her drive to the coast and reclaim her own life without stepping in front of it, who had answered his phone on the first ring and arrived in 40 minutes and never once pretended she needed to be handled. "I have a 7-year-old, she said. "She names fish after military ranks, and she's in a phase where she asks a lot of questions about how things work. Engines, clouds, why people do things. She will ask you questions." "I can answer questions," he said. "You might not like some of hers. I expect not. No flinch, no qualification, just the clear, steady weight of someone who'd decided to stop flinching. I'm not." She stopped, started again. "Whatever this is, it won't be easy. Things worth having aren't." He looked at her with the same directness he'd used in this room the first time, except now it felt different. Less like threat assessment, more like an honest accounting. "I'm not asking you for something easy. I'm asking if you want to try something real." Adeline thought about the card she'd pulled from the trash at 2 in the morning. She thought about the drive back from Tillamook, 40 miles of silence, and then the truth of a man she hadn't expected to recognize. She thought about Petra, who would be down in 20 minutes for her before-school hot chocolate, who would walk in and see this man at the counter and ask him 17 questions before she'd even taken her coat off. She thought about what it meant to choose something instead of letting choices be made around her. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Just the one word." Reed Callahan wrapped both hands around his lavender honey latte, still the thing she'd have least expected from him, and for the first time since she'd met him, the careful, controlled stillness of his face broke into something that looked almost like relief. They didn't fix everything that morning. They didn't fix anything, technically. He finished his coffee and left because she had a cafe to run, and he had appointments she didn't ask about. Petra came downstairs, immediately identified. A stranger had recently occupied the counter stool because she was 7 and observant, in the way that children were when they were paying close attention to who came through their mother's life, and asked 2 questions about Reed before Adeline had even confirmed his existence. "He's someone I know from work," Adeline said. "What kind of work? Complicated work." Petra considered this. "Does he know about Captain?" "Not yet. He should probably know about Captain," Petra said seriously. "It's important context." Adeline made her hot chocolate and thought, yes, it is. 6 months later, Portland had a wet November, which in Portland was not news. Reed had, over those months, become a presence. Not a constant one. He traveled. He had his own life that was still in the process of being reconstructed, and she had a cafe and a daughter, and no interest in moving fast toward anything that couldn't bear the weight of being real. But present. Specifically, consistently present. The kind of present that showed up when Petra had a fever and Adeline had a morning rush, and he sat in the apartment upstairs reading chapter books aloud to a miserable 7-year-old for 2 hours without being asked twice. The kind that appeared on a Tuesday with a new coffee grinder because he'd remembered she'd said the old one was half broken for a year before she fixed it. The kind that didn't need to be visible all the time to be relied on. She told her sister about him over the phone one Sunday while Petra was at a birthday party. Her sister asked if she was sure. Adeline thought about that. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm not sure about anything. I was sure about Daniel. That's not reassuring." She looked out the window at the street below, at the rain moving along the curb. "But I think I trust him, and I think that's different from being sure." Her sister was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," she said, "that probably is." That evening, Reed came by after Petra was in bed. They sat in her kitchen with the kind of coffee she made for herself, not for customers, strong, slightly over-extracted, the way she liked it, and she told him about the conversation with her sister. "She wanted to know if I was sure," Adeline said. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." He nodded, slowly, like he was turning that over. Outside, rain moved across the window in sheets. Portland's particular November dark, the kind that settled in the bones of the city and stayed until March. "I spent a long time," he said, "making decisions as if certainty was available. Like if I was careful enough, controlled enough, knew enough, then I could guarantee outcomes." He held his cup with both hands. "That's a useful delusion in some kinds of work, and a genuinely destructive one in everything else. When did you stop?" "I'm not sure I've stopped. I just started noticing when I was doing it." He looked at her. "I'm not certain either, but I'm here." Adeline thought about the word here. It was a small word for what it meant. This kitchen, this city, this life she'd built on her own out of what hadn't killed her. "I think," she said carefully, "that here might be enough." It wasn't the declaration that stories were supposed to end on. It wasn't the version where everything resolved into clarity, and the past lost its weight, and 2 people who'd been broken by different things somehow became unbroken. But it was true. And after 4 years of telling herself that hard things were nothing, she'd become very interested in things that were something. Even the small, specific, difficult, something of 2 people sitting in a kitchen in the Portland rain, deciding that here was a place worth staying. Reed set down his cup. He looked at her with that particular directness she'd learned to read. Not threat assessment anymore, not calculation. Just a man looking at the thing he'd chosen without flinching. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it is."